So, so first, let me say, thanks to Maurice and Tom, who's not here, and Colonel Watson for the kind invitation to speak with you. This project, this book, came out of really like the frustration that my co-author Eli Berman and Joe Felter and I felt watching some of the policy debates in 2004 and 5 around the various places where the U.S. was engaged in conflict. And so, Eli is a veteran of the Israeli Defense Forces. Joe's a colonel, or was a colonel in the Army while we did this. He's now the DASD for South Asia. But when we were talking and kind of watching the policy debates around what the U.S. should do in Afghanistan and Iraq in 2005 and 6, it felt like a lot of the intuition that people had for how to think about those debates was coming from this upper picture. So does anyone kind of recognize that photo? Yeah, that's one of what's called like the Magnificent 11, the 11 surviving photos of the first wave hitting Omaha Beach. And the soldiers in that photo are the 16th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Division of the U.S. Army. So are these guys in March 2007 pulling security duty on a local municipal council hall in Baghdad. And we were looking at the debates people were having, and they were talking about the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, drawing on intuition from like that kind of situation. And yet we were looking at the wars, and Joe was deploying to fight in them, and I was spending some time doing field research in Afghanistan. And we were like looking at those, and that was not at all the dynamic that was in play. And so we felt like we should start digging into the process a little more. And so the book really comes out of our effort to do that. So that's like the backstory for the book. While we're talking today, I'm going to show you some data. I'm going to talk about strategic interactions between insurgents and government forces. As I do this, please interrupt me as we go if you have questions or things are not clear, because that'll be more entertaining. And then I'd also encourage you to think about drawing on the lesson that you had from last week. Of the claims that I'm making, is the evidence that I'm showing you, in fact, good evidence for the claims I'm making? And what kinds of things do you have to assume about the things I'm showing you to think that they will apply in the other contexts that you might be interested in thinking about applying them to? And let's have a discussion about that. I think that'll be much more entertaining. So with that in mind, here's basically the agenda for today. So I want to give you some motivation for the overall project. We'll then talk about, I'm not going to show you a mathematical model. There is one. I'm happy to talk about it with anyone. I'm just going to tell you a story instead about a father on a really crappy night in the Philippines as a way of illustrating the dynamic of what we think goes on inside today's asymmetric conflicts. And then what I want to do is walk you through a set of results about different relationships that are highly policy relevant in the context of today's conflicts, and give you a little bit of a flavor for the kind of evidence we use in the book to make claims about that overall theory, and then talk about the strategic so what at the end. And hopefully we can have a good discussion, as I said, as we go. So that's the basic agenda. So let's get into the motivation for the book. So I want to make basically two observations about conflicts over the last few years. But I want to start just by showing you a little bit of data. So what these plots are showing you is on the upper plot there on the left is showing you battle deaths from conflict in different kinds of wars going back to 1945 through 2008. And what you'll notice there is that if you look at the different types of conflicts, so there's kind of intrastate wars and interstate wars, and you'll notice that after about 1990, almost all the battle deaths in conflict around the world are happening in intrastate wars. And most of those wars are asymmetric in the sense that there is one party which has a huge advantage in applying combat power at a given time and place compared to the other party. So that's kind of the overall trend. And then you'll notice that the vast majority of conflicts there on the upper right are happening in intrastate conflicts. So war between states is just not really a thing in the modern world anymore. Maybe it will be again in the future, but as far as the wars that we've seen since 45, it's not prominent. And then down at the bottom is just showing you on the left, the rate of new overseas military interventions by the US and NATO. And then on the right bottom panel, the number that are ongoing. And so I show this just by way of saying, like, if you wanted to believe that like the US and its NATO allies and Western countries were unlikely to be involved in fights like the ones in Afghanistan and Iraq, or in supporting fights like the ones in Colombia or Pakistan or India or Yemen in the near future, historically, that seems unlikely, right? The trend is not in that direction. There's no point in time here where the number of new military interventions has been dropping going back to basically the 1950s. So that's motivation for the topic. And then if you look across all these conflicts, there are a couple things that seem to be true. So the first observation is kind of there. And I'm curious, for those of you who have been in these fights, like, I'm sure there are examples that come to mind for this, where you implemented some policy, or you were part of implementing some policy that everyone thought would work, and it just didn't. And that reflects both the fact that these are complex environments, but also the fact that we don't really, I think, as a policy community, or we didn't have a great idea what would go on. So I want to show you my favorite example of these. And so what's on this plot? So what's on this plot is, in the x-axis is time, and the y-axis is the number of combat incidents, total insurgent attacks, recorded by NATO forces in Afghanistan, the 3-month moving average of that thing, from basically 2002, when the US and NATO start tracking combat incidents consistently in a database, through 2014. And this is data that was declassified through working with ISAF and the US government over a number of years. The two lines there, the vertical lines, separate the operational period of something called the Local Governance and Community Development Program, LGCD. And LGCD was USAID's, for many years, flagship development program in Afghanistan. And I just want to read to you from like how the program is described, because I think it's informative of like a deep misunderstanding. And so the program was designed, and this is the quote, to encourage communities in the most volatile parts of the country to turn away from the insurgency and towards the government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. We set out to do this in large part by facilitating 2,635 community projects that addressed local grievances, fostered stability, facilitated dialogue, and engendered trust in district and provincial leaders. Acknowledged as USAID's flagship stabilization program, LGCD achieved its aims to a large degree. So that's from the website of the contractor which implemented this program, which by the time it was done, basically accounted for about $900 million in US government spending. Now, I'm not really good with the data, but if you look at 2006 when the program started, there's a small difference between the trend in places that would get LGCD and ones that wouldn't. And then if you track over the program period, almost every fighting season, the gap between how violent the places where this program, which is supposed to be helping, is being done, and everywhere else, seems to be getting bigger. Right? So this plot down here just shows you the difference. And you'll notice, with the exception of the 2011 and 2010 fighting seasons, LGCD LGCD districts are way worse in almost every year. So, like, this doesn't mean that the program made things worse. Right? Maybe the program was targeted at harder places. Right? And given that it was expected to help, that's a reasonable thing to expect. But what it suggests at the very least is that we have this problem, which is things that people thought would help in a really obvious way often did not. So that's the first observation. The second observation I want to make is that if you look at these conflicts, and we've collected very fine-grained data on many different conflicts, there's no one narrative to how things have gone. And for everyone who spent time in these places, that is like blindingly obvious. But it was not part of the national policy discourse. So let me show you some data on this. So I'm going to show you a series of these plots. And what these are is for different countries. I'm going to show you on a per capitized basis the monthly combat incidents for the 24 most violent districts. So In Afghanistan, there are 398 districts in Afghanistan, about 40 to 50,000 people in the modal district. In Iraq, there's 104, about 100,000 in the modal district. And these are from administrative data from the US military, the monthly combat incidents per 1,000 population in each country. And what you might notice is there are some patterns that are consistent. So Afghanistan, you see really obvious seasonality to the fighting season. Not so much in Iraq, which is not surprising. But notice just the differences in the trends across places. So in Iraq, for example, you have areas like Fallujah, which are very violent in 2004, 5, and 6, and then not really violent at all on a per capita basis afterwards. You have places like Ramadi, which basically by mid-2007 stopped being violent. And then you have places like Balad, where the peak in the violence comes in 2007, 2008. So each of these places follows like a distinct dynamic. And that's true in Afghanistan as well. You can look at this. We've developed data on Pakistan and the Philippines as well. So analogous data in Pakistan, these are districts of Pakistan. There are about 100 districts in Pakistan. In the Philippines, these are done by the province, so there's 74 provinces. You'll notice the scale of the violence is significantly lower. These are now per 10,000 population, and we're averaging quarterly because there's a longer period of time here, 88 to 2010 in Pakistan, and 75 to 2008, basically in the Philippines. And again, these are administrative data collected by the governments on conflict incidents. And you'll notice, again, there's like huge variation locally. And so why is that important? It's important because something different is going on in each of these places. So whatever the explanation is that we want to work towards for understanding these conflicts, it should explain this variance down at the local level. That's like the first way it's important. The second way it's important is there's all this local variance means that there is a lot to understand here. So we have this whole toolkit that you guys were talking about the other day in terms of data analytics and what we call program evaluation, where you think about the effect of policies on some outcome. So the fact that we have all this variation in the outcome of the intensity of conflict at the level of a village or a valley means we can grab this toolkit from social science and do a lot to try and understand what's going on in these conflicts. So that's the second observation to frame the work. The third observation that kind of is, I don't know, maybe this nests under the second, is it's not just levels of combat that are highly variable. So what this plot is showing you is for 10 districts of Baghdad from mid-2005 through the end of 2009, basically public opinion data. So multinational core Iraq, the kind of command of the US military that owned the day-to-day fight in Iraq for much of the war, collected almost every month over this period a survey of about 9,000 people in Baghdad. And they asked them a bunch of questions like, do you support attacks against coalition forces? And this will be obvious for your audience, but this was a highly dangerous task. A number of enumerators died collecting these data. But what you'll notice is that each neighborhood of Baghdad follows a very different dynamic. So Kark, which is where the green zone is, for a long time, basically until kind of mid-2006, the majority of the residents of Kark supported attack against coalition forces, like when they were asked by these surveyors, and then something changes. The opposite dynamic is going on in the neighborhoods of Kadamiyya and Karada. And so there's something to understand here. There's not one pattern. There's not one trend. And I'm happy to talk about the results of using those data at some point. But the key point is within these conflicts, we can learn a lot by going kind of inside of them and trying to understand what's happening in different places. So that's the big agenda that we're after here. So what's our model of how these work? I'm going to put on the screen here some quotes, and they're not I'm going to tell you a story while these quotes are up, and then we'll talk about kind of what that story means. But this is the basic model. And when you think about asymmetric conflicts, you've got these different participants in it. So you have the government and its allies. And they can do some obvious things. They can kill or capture insurgents. They can try and run signals intelligence to collect information. They can run development projects. They can put various things into the system. They are also consumers of information coming from the population. And I'll make this very concrete in a minute, but what you should have in the back of your head is think about like the neighborhood you live in. If someone were in the middle of the night to try and set up an ambush on the street outside your house, do you think they could do that without you knowing about it? Maybe, maybe not. Probably not most of the time. And so you then, as a civilian, have information which could be shared with the government forces. Now, there are rebels out there as well, and in a lot of contexts, they provide services to the population. They also, in a lot of contexts, will enact retribution against people who share information. And the government is fighting them. And there's a bunch of stuff going on here, and we're going to look at some of these specific services in a bit. But I want to provide like a little bit of a flavor for how the participants in these conflicts think about these things. And Vic Corpus is going to show up a couple of times in these. Has anyone heard of Vic before? So for anyone who's like studied the insurgency or counterinsurgency in the Philippines, he's an interesting character because he was an officer in the armed forces of the Philippines, defected and fought with the communist New People's Army for many years. Then during the purges in that organization, basically got disenchanted, switched back, spent some time in prison, and then rose to the rank of brigadier general in the Philippine military. And Vic is a good friend of my co-author Joe's, and so we spent a lot of time talking to Vic about how the insurgency in the Philippines worked. But while you're looking at things that Vic was saying, I want you to imagine for a minute a father in a small town, it can be in the Philippines or in Africa or in Iraq or Afghanistan, who's in bed at 2 in the morning, and he's in a village, and he hears some movement in the alley behind his house. And this is a village that is contested. There are insurgents in the village who occasionally conduct attacks on patrols. And almost certainly tomorrow morning, he knows that there's going to be a government patrol coming down the alley behind his house. And his 2 kids are sleeping, his 2 daughters, let's say, are sleeping in the bedroom next to him. His wife is in bed next to him. No one else hears this, but he hears some people moving around there. And now he's got to think about, well, what's going on? So it's surely not the government, because they never send just a couple people to move around, and no one moves around at night unless they're a rebel, because there's a curfew on and it's really dangerous. So what's going on? Well, maybe there is they're preparing an ambush, or maybe they're setting an IED. And if an ambush happens, that's dangerous for his family, because his cousin, a few weeks back, his cousin's daughter got killed by an errant RPG during a firefight. So now he's got to decide what to do. And as he's sitting there kind of thinking about that, because he could hop on his phone, and he could call in a tip to the local tip line, and then maybe tomorrow morning the government forces would be there waiting for the rebels. But that's tricky, because in the past, he's a Muslim. I'd say that we're in the southern Philippines. He's a Muslim, and while the government soldiers, they might be perfectly nice, like they're Christians, and they're the descendants of the Spaniards who came and took the land from his family in 1500, and from his people in 1500. So he doesn't really like them much. Like his politics, he'd rather not have them in control. So he's thinking about this, and he's got his phone in his hand. He's got to wonder what happens. And maybe if he calls the government soldiers, maybe they will arrest the people who did this and do so in a careful way, but maybe they will carelessly, maybe they will be careless in how they engage the enemy tomorrow morning. And that's risky for his family. So he's got to worry about that. Now, he steps back for a minute. Now it's 4 a.m. He still hasn't done anything. The patrol's coming by in a couple hours. He's sitting there staring at his phone. Should he just tell his family to go into the bathroom and the place with no windows and hope for the best in the morning? Should he call his cousin across the street and warn him about what he's heard? And he's sitting there and he is thinking about this. And he knows that normally the rebels are like really careful. They don't want to hurt the people because they understand that the people need them. And this is Vic talking about that from his time as Ka Ming, which is nom de guerre as a rebel. But again, sometimes things go wrong, despite the best intentions. Sometimes things happen. And so you've got all three players in this interaction. Basically, depending on the outcome of this, depends on what does that father do in the middle of the night when he hears the noise in his alley. Like that's what, I mean, that's kind of like the critical actor here. And so in this setting, the calculus of the rebels is basically what Vic is saying here, which is they look at that particular place and they want to figure out what can we do in this place without alienating the population. And you can formalize this as a mathematical model in which a bunch of things happen. So, the government decides how many forces to apply, the rebels decide how hard to fight, the civilians think about the aid they're getting from both sides and decide who's going to make them better off, and then make a decision on information sharing. You can look at this a bunch of ways, but ultimately what you come out with, almost no matter how you model this, is that the critical decision is not the rebels deciding how much violence can we produce, like what's the maximal use of our personnel and equipment. It's what can we do before the population turns against us. And an interesting thing is you absolutely see this in captured documents from rebels. So this is I think, one of the more informative quotes from something called the Harmony Database, which is a database of millions of documents that the US government has captured on the battlefield in various places going back to 1998. So this particular letter was captured on a courier who was stopped at a checkpoint in early 2006. It was on a pen drive in his pocket. And this is a letter that a cell leader in Ramadi is writing to senior members of the organization Al-Qaeda in Iraq shortly after they killed one of the tribal leaders in Ramadi in the event that many people think kicked off the Anbar awakening. And so Abu Usama basically writes up to his leaders saying, hey, we did something. And the leaders write back to him, and they basically are saying, look, man, you are producing a level of violence which exceeds what the population will tolerate, and they're going to start sharing information on you. They're going to start cooperating with the enemy. In this case, Abu Usama writes back, and because the courier was carrying his reply, Abu Usama writes back and says, that's fine, I got it, but I would like some standard rules of engagement, because every time one of you guys gets knocked off, I get new rules for how I'm supposed to do my job. And so can I get some standard operating procedures, basically? But this is not unique. So this is Vic Corpus writing about this when he's with the New People's Army. And you see in documents of like the Mau Mau insurgents in Kenya and of various drug-selling gangs in Mexico and of the FARC in Colombia and the Taliban in Afghanistan, you see this concern with setting the appropriate level of violence. And so if we're in this world where the thing that is being contested is the willingness of civilians to share information, and if they do it based on this rational calculation, like that father thinking about, okay, if I call in the tip, I like it when the government controls the territory because then they come in and do some aid programs. And if there are IED programs going off, like the development guys won't come in and we won't have the school refurbished. But he also doesn't like the violence and he doesn't like them politically. So if we're in that world where you're making that rational calculation, that has a number of very concrete implications. And what we do in the book is we try to pull those together across a lot of settings. So what I want to do here is talk about kind of 4 of them. And so those are the 4 there. The first is basically thing I'm going to show you is that when you introduce cellular communications in an area, you create a new option for calling in that tip, and you're going to get an expected result. And we'll talk about development assistance, military suppression, and civilian harm. To step to the lecture you guys heard the other day about how do you think about using data, what we're doing here is we're taking an argument about how the interaction works, and we're trying to test it from like multiple perspectives. So the argument has implications for how each of these should work, and we're going to evaluate those. So let's do that. So the first thing to talk about is cellular communication. So what these maps show you is they show you basically the build out of the cell phone network in Iraq between 2003 and 2008, 2004 and 2009. So what's interesting about the cellular communications network in Iraq is it is built out as the civil war is raging. So what each of these shows you, say for 2004, is in black are the cell phone towers that are turned on at the start of that year. In red are the towers that will be built and turned on in that year. And in gray are the ones that aren't going to be turned on until some point in the future. And you can see that the cellular network basically kind of gets built out over time. And I spent a lot of time talking to the people who built this network. And because of the geography of combat in Iraq, they were able to build even during the worst parts of the war. So they were actually, during the Second Battle of Fallujah, they were actually putting up towers in Fallujah, just in parts of the city that weren't being affected by the combat. When you look at what happens in these areas is you have two kinds of towers that are getting built here. You have towers that are built which put coverage over an area for the first time. And then you have towers that are built because there's a lot of demand in an area, and you need more towers so that people can get through. When you put down towers which give coverage to an area for the first time, you get a reduction in the rate at which IEDs are planted of about 50% from the mean level of IED attacks. So think about that father. You give him the option to call in the tip on his cell phone for the first time instead of having to meet face-to-face with the counterinsurgent forces, and violence drops in half in his neighborhood, in his alley. So that's consistent with this idea that the civilians are making this rational calculation about information sharing. And you see similar things in other settings. So that's kind of the first result. The second result I want to talk about is what happens with development assistance. And so each of these plots shows you basically the effect of something called the Commander's Emergency Response Program in Iraq, depending on the presence or not of a provincial reconstruction team. So let me unpack this a little bit. So each of these dots represents one of the 104 districts of Iraq for a 6-month period. The x-axis is basically the change from that 6-month period to the previous one in the amount of spending on here SERP projects that are under $50,000 in value, and here ones that are over $50,000. So, and then the y-axis is the change in combat incidents per 100,000 population. So these are places that got less money under this program and saw less violence, more money under the program, more violence, less violence, more money under the program, more violence, et cetera. So what was the program? Well, SERP was designed as a way to provide commanders on the ground with small amounts of development funds that they could spend on aid projects that were of benefit to the local community. So this could be like repairing a retaining wall at a school, digging a well slightly deeper to revitalize it, fixing a culvert or a small piece of road, paying a security force for a couple months' work. And these lines show you the relationship between changes in SERP and changes in combat incidents in two different kinds of places. So one are places where a PRT has just been introduced, and the other is one where the PRT has not been introduced. So what's a PRT? PRT is a provincial reconstruction team. These were teams of about 20 people that were deployed to different places of Iraq at different times. And the idea was that they were going to provide a little bit of development expertise to the local military units. So what you can think of this doing is basically you had about 20 more people to coordinate the kinetic and non-kinetic parts of the military effort, and you had a little bit more expertise. And when you do that, what you see is that these small-scale aid projects, so little things, not anything that's going to change the employment conditions in the community or fundamentally give people more income. It's like a small thing that's useful to the community for a short period of time. If you do that in places where you have that little bit extra kick in terms of development expertise and experience, violence drops significantly. And to give you a sense of this, this is about $100,000 of spending buys you one less significant combat incident in an average district of Iraq. So whether you think that's like cheap or expensive, it's about what the numbers work out to. You get a much weaker effect in places that don't have that little bit of extra expertise. And so the way to think about this, or at least the way we'd like you to think about this, is if you spend a given amount of money in ways that are a little bit more like valuable to the community, you get a little bit less violence than if you spend the same amount of money without the people present who can help you spend it in ways that make it useful for the community. It's consistent with the idea that small-scale spending helps. Now, if you do this same thing for big development projects, so things run by USAID, or things run that are designed to like put in a water treatment plant or fix a huge stretch of road or employ thousands of people, you get no similar result. It's just dead flat or actually upward sloping. So other kinds of spending aren't working, which is consistent with the story I told you about the father making that decision about who's going to be better off tomorrow. Like, is he better off tomorrow if the government's there or if the rebels are there? It's not consistent with the theory which says that father picks up the phone only if he's got a good job or only if he's happy about the way the economy's going, or those other kinds of stories that people sometimes like to tell. Okay, so that's the second result. The third result is on the effect of force by the government. So one implication of the story that I told you is when that father calls in the tip, for that thing to be acted on, there need to be forces present who can use the information. There needs to be someone who can go out and act on the information. And so what you should see is that the violence-reducing effect of different kinds of activities is greater when there are more forces present rather than less. So let me say that again. The violence-reducing effect of non-military activities that are designed to get information from the population should be greater when there are more forces present rather than less. And so that's basically what these graphs are showing you. So the x-axis here is for any given district of Iraq for a 6-month period, the number of maneuver battalions that are present in that district in that 6-month period. And we built this out not because the US Army has good records of this stuff. Sadly, they don't have it aggregated in this way. We went through lots of like press reports and social media and figured out like where every battalion was in Iraq for most of the war. And you range from kind of 0 to, at one point in the surge, you had 8 battalions operating in one district in Baghdad. And then the y-axis is the effect of different kinds of aid spending on violence. So if you increase aid spending by a certain amount, what happens to violence? And what you see is that consistently across small-scale CERT projects, so $50,000 or less, large-scale ones, and then this thing called CSP, which is the Community Stabilization Program, a USAID program that was designed to give small amounts of benefits to local communities. The more forces that were present, the more violence-reducing that money was. So the more no bang for the buck. If you look at this same thing in Afghanistan, you see exactly the same pattern. So if you look at CERT spending in Afghanistan, the more that is spent, the less violent there is when it is spent in districts that have a FOB in them, like a forward operating base. So you have people who can act on the information, and not when the same amount is spent in a district to which soldiers are commuting, right, where there's not a FOB actually located there. So what is this, like, as a matter of practical policy, this is kind of valuable because it tells you you probably shouldn't be spending aid money in places where you don't have a lot of forces if your goal with the aid money is to reduce violence. But it's also consistent with this idea that what you're getting with the aid is not a change because you're shifting people's economic conditions or you're kind of winning them over through the provision of benefits. You're getting a change because they share information more when they get the projects. And so if there are people to take advantage of the projects, violence goes down, but not otherwise. Okay, so that's the third result. The last result, I don't have a great graph for, so I'm going to show you a lot of graphs. One thing that is implicit in the story I told you about the father and in Vic's comments about what it was like being on both sides of the war in the Philippines is that when one side or the other harms civilians, there should be a response against them directly in terms of sharing information. So in Iraq, when the US and Iraqi forces killed civilians mistakenly in combat, in the next period, the amount of information that people share with them should go down, and the opposite for the insurgents. And so what I'm showing you here on the left is kind of slightly reformatted versions of graphs that were in a set of briefings provided to multinational corps Iraq, in which for every week from June 2007 through basically June 2008, they recorded for every province of Iraq, so 17 provinces of Iraq, but only 13 of them had significant conflict at this period. For each one of those, it's showing you the number of what they called preemptive tips. They're in light gray, so those are tips that were called in, which were acted upon in a way which prevented an attack. And then what they called informational tips, which are tips that were called in that were useful for them in operations but didn't actually prevent an attack. So basically, for every province of Iraq, for this 60-week period, you know how many tips are being called in to US and Iraqi forces of different types. And these all kind of came out of a FOIA request. We've subsequently gotten much more fine-grained data for Afghanistan for the entire period of the war, declassified. And the results are the same as what I'm going to tell you about. So what you have over here on the right is each of these plots shows you for one of the 13 provinces where there's significant conflict. In green are the number of civilians accidentally killed by coalition forces. And in orange are the number accidentally killed by the insurgents. So this is not the intentional targeting of civilians for purposes of intimidation. You know, this represents a combat incident where the insurgents were targeting US or Iraqi forces, and they mistakenly killed a number of civilians. And so what you can do is you might notice that, you know, if you stare at that thing long enough, there's really no pattern to it. These things seem like accidents. And I mean, that's because they are accidents, right? The US, you know, is not, and Iraqi forces are not in these incidents going out and seeking to harm civilians. It's that in a combat engagement, you know, someone is aiming at a vehicle over in that direction, and their vehicle gets jostled a little bit, so the aim shifts a little bit. And that 50 cal bullet, instead of going into its intended target, proceeds through a house and strikes a civilian. And so that's what's reflected here on both sides. So what we can do is we can then take that and we can look at what happens after that harm occurs to the flow of information to coalition forces. And what you see is exactly the symmetrical relationship that those quotes from Vic would lead you to expect. When coalition forces harm civilians, the flow of information comes down, and it's about 2 fewer tips in the next week that are useful per civilian who is harmed. And the opposite for insurgents. Now, the anti-insurgent effect is about half the size of the anti-coalition one. So there's a sense in which, like, the home team gets a pass for the cost it imposes on the population. And when we've run more or less the same analysis in Afghanistan, 2 of my students did this, Austin Wright, who's at University of Chicago, and Andrew Shaver, who's out at Stanford, you find pretty much exactly the same thing. When the Taliban kill civilians, the flow of tips to US and Afghan forces in the next couple weeks goes up, and the opposite when ISAF causes harm. So there's that symmetric reaction. Okay, so what I've told you is there's this theory for what goes on inside asymmetric conflicts, which is that it's really like, it's the decisions of the civilians who aren't directly involved about sharing information that are critical. And then I've described a bunch of evidence, there's like a ton more in the book, about the individual relationships between particular factors in these conflict and levels of violence are all kind of consistent with that story. And so then the question is, well, like, so what, right? What's the strategic implications of this? And I think this is like a very deep question, because if you think about the history of the war in Afghanistan, it's tempting to say, like, look, Jake, like, what you just told me is basically that, like, the practitioners who've been doing counterinsurgency since, like, the 40s and 50s are going back to, like, Napoleon's forces in Spain, like, they kind of know what they're doing, right? There's nothing that I've told you that is inconsistent with US doctrine. It's maybe a little more specific, and maybe like, there's, in the doctrine, there's like a whole bunch of other stuff going on that we didn't find evidence for. But what we found evidence for is a subset of the doctrine. So it's tempting to say, yeah, like, so what? You told me something I already knew. But then you run into the critique that, like, John Gentile and others have made very persuasively, which is, look, like, we go into Afghanistan in 2001. So these are the horse soldiers, the first special forces team that deploys to Afghanistan in 2001. You rout the Taliban. They come back, and then the US and Afghan government very aggressively deploy more or less the kinds of things that would be implied by the arguments I've been making. And so this is General Stanley McChrystal in 2010, in March 2010, walking through the town of Marja in Helmand, Afghanistan. This was in 2010, like a big moment in the counterinsurgency campaign. Marja is today still held by the government, but everything around it is not. And then this last picture is from Ghazni, Afghanistan earlier this year, which the US and Afghan forces barely held. And so you look at this progression, and John and other people look at that, and they're like, this whole damn counterinsurgency thing, like, it's stupid, it's wrong, it's incorrect. Because look, we did mostly the things that, that our book says you should do to win the village or the valley, and we got this crap strategic outcome. And so it's fundamentally the wrong thing to do. And I think that's a slightly like blinkered way to think about this, and I think this would be a great thing to talk about. So all the evidence suggests there is an algorithm that will win you the village or the valley, and it can kind of be priced out in the sense of there are certain kinds of aid projects you can do, there are certain kinds of goods you can provide civilians, you give them access to communications, and an appropriate level of forces, you can bring those areas under control. So that seems to be quite clear, and the evidence for that is consistent across a whole bunch of conflicts fought by a whole bunch of countries over 30, 40 years. It's clear that small policy changes can have big effects. So when you put that cell phone tower up that I mentioned, the cost of putting in a cell phone tower on an existing structure in Iraq at the height of the war was like $20,000 if it was on an existing structure, and maybe $200,000 if you had to build a tower in a green field fresh. That's a lot of money to get a 50% reduction in IED attacks in the area for which that provides coverage. So that's for sure true. And the aid spending I was describing, the CERT program in Iraq, which I showed you worked really well, over the course of the entire war, that was about $3 billion, compared to almost $80 billion in large-scale reconstruction spending, which had no discernible effect on levels of conflict. So small policies can have big effects. But I think this is a really important point, is that clearly, right, you look at this projection of pictures, or like pick the ones that you would like to think about, it clearly does not always get you the strategic outcome. And one of the mistakes that I think if you think back on the strategic discourse in 2009 and 10 that the US government and others made was a set of people persuasively made the case for this. General McChrystal, then Director Petraeus, and others made the case that, look, we know how to do that first thing. Right? We did it in Iraq in 2007 and 8. Other countries have done it in other places. That's kind of a soluble problem. But there was no story for how it got you to the strategic outcome. And I think the big thing I want to leave you with is you have to have that story. You have to have that strategic vision for how do you get from the local victories to the national political outcome that you want for engaging in these kinds of conflicts to make sense. And look, you can think about lots of ways that local victories can lead to good outcomes. So, for example, in India, the government has successfully pushed the Naxalite insurgency back from a number of highly productive areas for mining and industrial development in the Naxal-affected belts, particularly in the state of Chhattisgarh. And you've had this like economic explosion as a result. And so now the Naxalite rebels' story to their supporting population that, look, the government doesn't know how to provide economic growth for us, it's not so tenable anymore, right? Because they can look at the airport in Chhattisgarh, which is like, it's a place probably most of you have never heard of. Their airport is like as nice as Newark because it is now a major center of coal and iron ore production because the Indian state won a bunch of local victories against the Naxalites and pushed them far enough away that economic growth could take out. Or you can think about the case of Colombia. We were talking about this one earlier. One version of how Colombia got to a deal with the FARC when it did is that the government, starting in 2002 to 2005, successfully executed a counterinsurgency campaign in two respects. With help from the US taxpayer, they got the mobility assets so that they could take advantage of the information civilians were providing and go out and attack the FARC in the jungle. And they got the right-wing paramilitaries under control so that the parts of their population, the civilians who were on the left, didn't need to fear for their lives every night. And so they were more willing to support the government controlling the territory. And you effectively pushed the FARC out into the periphery. And then what do? Well, what they did is they basically sat on the conflict for a decade. And it wasn't that the conflict was over, and it wasn't that the FARC were gone. They were still fighting, and there was still violence going on in the countryside, but it wasn't where anyone cared about it. And two things happened at that point in time. One is the FARC's leaders, they got old, and they decided they wanted to retire and become normal politicians. And so the set of bargains that they would accept changed. The other thing that happened is the average Colombian forgot about the fact that in 2002, the FARC were shooting mortars at the presidential inauguration from the hills above Bogota, and just started thinking, look, we want an end to this conflict. And so the government could make an offer that would have been politically impossible 5 years before, and the FARC leadership were willing to take an offer that they never would have accepted 5 years before. And so in that case, winning these local victories and then sitting on the conflict for a decade got you to the point where you could get a positive resolution to the political problem. And so the thing I want to leave you with is, what you should take away from this lecture is you can totally do that. But you need a story, you need a strategy for how doing that is going to get you to the political outcome before you should think about engaging in these kinds of conflicts. Okay, so let me stop there. We've got, I think, 15, 20 minutes for questions. I can't have been that clear. There's no way. Yes, sir.
You got to hold it? Hold it, okay. I'm sorry. Lieutenant Colonel Tom Spar. Have you looked at all at, with this construct at the Korean War and the aftermath of the Korean War? Because I think you see a similar phenomenon there from my knowledge of it, whereas South Korea was kind of a mess afterwards. You had corruption throughout the government, and it took time. It took time and a sustained U.S. presence for that really to work itself out. Because I have a theory that I think it's a pretty good model for if you're going to go in, you got to go in with a long-term commitment. But I just wanted to hear your perspective on that. Thank you.
So we haven't looked at the Korean War from that perspective, mainly because there wasn't a significant insurgency there after the war. Like the symmetric war kind of pushed the boundary to a certain point, and then it stopped. The place that is maybe a little more informative for the kinds of for thinking about asymmetric conflict is Eastern Europe, and particularly the Ukraine and western parts of Russia after World War II. And basically, the Soviets fought an insurgency until 1954 in the territory, basically from the Polish border to kind of about 100 miles from Moscow. And in that counterinsurgency, it turned out that a lot of the same patterns that we find in terms of not being terribly abusive to local populations and providing local public goods or reducing violence, that turns out to probably be true. So there's a professor at Michigan, Yuri Zhukov, who's done kind of amazing work with the archives of the Soviet Union to understand that insurgency and counterinsurgency. And it looks very consistent with the story that I've just told you. They were willing to do things that the governments I've been talking about were not willing to do. But when they did the things that we've said here kind of worked, they seemed to work in that conflict. Yes, sir.
Hey, Jake, thanks for coming. Al Lord on the faculty.
My pleasure.
It seems to me there's a lot here that parallels you can draw with policing, especially like in the inner city, to achieve positive outcomes. Have you looked at that?
Yeah.
And if you have, are there any like broader sociological assumptions or conclusions you can make?
Yeah, exactly. So it's a great question, Al. And basically, the game theoretic model that we developed for this comes out of actually and is derived as an extension of a model of policing that Janet Yellen, who was the chair of the Fed, and George Akerlof, who's her husband, who won the Nobel in economics. They wrote this model of policing down in the 1970s, which was basically trying to answer the question of why doesn't just straight intense deterrence in policing work? So Gary Becker had this model of crime where he said, look, crime is rational. You engage in crime if the expected benefits of doing so exceed the expected costs. So what we should do to get rid of crime is we should just, execute everyone who steals a car. And Akerlof and Yellen looked at that and they're like, well, that's stupid, because if you execute everyone who steals a car, then no one's going to tell you about the people who steal cars because they think it's unjust to execute them for stealing a car. And you're not going to make any cases, and crime is going to go through the roof. And so when we thought about writing down the kind of model that's described there, that policing problem was the inspiration. And the thought was, if you think about the civilian and the insurgents, the civilians making this calculation of like, I don't like some of the things they're doing. I also like their politics. And if the government is going to be really abusive, then I'll tolerate the things they're doing and the cost that the insurgents imposes on me. But if the government's a little bit nicer, then my calculus shifts, and I'll share information and accept the government. And so that's absolutely came out of this idea of policing. One of my students, Austin Wright, is doing this work now in Chicago with the Chicago Police, where they're testing this set of ideas against data from CPD and looking at basically when you get civilian complaints of police brutality, what happens to the rate at which people call in tips about crime in their neighborhood or call in complaints about the police officers. So yeah, there's absolutely deep parallels. I'm actually working on a project now in Pakistan with the police, where one of the things we're doing is we're experimenting with creating these local, basically kind of police community meetings on a regular basis, where the officers just like have to go to these small towns once a week, sit for 4 hours, hear people's complaints, and then they do everything else the same as they always would. And the theory is very much like here, that should give them a chance to get information, but also signal to the people that they care about their concerns, and then increase information sharing. Okay. Yes, sir.
Question on the, my name's Ken Burgess from Seminar 7.
Ken.
Question on the methodology.
Okay.
I mean, impressive data gathering, but how do you isolate the variables to determine the causal relationships? And specifically, the three main ones that you seem to highlight, cell phone towers, SERP expenditures, and size of the security force. One could argue that the size of the security force in and of itself is what enables building and sustaining cell phones, enables the distribution of SERP money. And so it's really, there's one singular causal variable and the others are following in its wake.
Yeah,
So
it's,
how do you kind of isolate those things in order to draw the conclusions that you do?
yeah, so that's a great question, and the short answer is it's different in each case. So one of the things about working on this stuff is, so like when we think about harm to civilians, how do we isolate the causal effect of harm to civilians? Well, you might think there's some like broad trend in the conflict, which is influencing how much risk there is to civilians. But once you account for that broad trend, you can see that a lot of these things are probably accidents. And so in this case, it's fairly straightforward, right? If you have an accident in one place, you can compare it to another place, which has the same trend in conflict up to that point, but one has the accident and the other doesn't. And so the statistics we're doing here are trying to isolate that. When you get to the cell phone towers, the way you isolate it is basically, we spent a lot of time talking to the people who built out this network. And they had like a very defined process for building it out. Basically, there was a meeting at the end of every year where they would decide on an expansion plan for the next year. And that plan would then go out to a radio engineering team, which based on just topographic maps and radio propagation models, would define these 100-meter circles that the towers would need to go in for the next year. They would then send that thing out to a team which would canvass the sites and decide where within that 100-meter circle were they going to put up the tower. So like on what building was it going to go, things like that. And they'd come up with 3 options. They would then hand that off to another team, the site acquisition team, which would go out and look at those options and try and nail down like the contracts necessary for one. So for example, they'd see like, okay, which building has like the best landlord, which one has a nice pad for a generator in the basement, which one can we access the most easily to fuel the generator, like all these other considerations. This whole process is deeply constrained by the fact that the way they did the backhaul on the towers, so to get the signal from the tower to the switch and then back out to the next tower, was with microwave shots between towers, because they couldn't lay fiber optic cable between the towers because it would get stolen. And so what that meant is if, say, I was trying to connect with you and there was another tower directly behind you, I would actually have to shift over a little bit where I was locating to connect with you without causing interference for the next tower. So they had all these constraints on what they were doing. And then when they went out to put up the towers, they weren't actually affected by violence because the violence during the war in Iraq almost all happens within 25 meters of a road. And so if you have a 100-meter radius ring to locate the tower in, even if you want to put it next to like Haifa Street in Baghdad, there's tons of IEDs going off throughout the war, you could just go like one street into a neighborhood on either side and be almost entirely unaffected by that violence. And so then the timing of the introduction of these towers based on the plan set at the start of the year depended on a whole bunch of random stuff, like what order had they done previous towers, when they went to a building to kind of set it up, like how many different claimants were there to the lease for that building? Did someone actually have their title, or did they have to like send to their family in Jordan to get the title? Like all these things kind of randomly affected the timing. And so then what we do is we look at the contrast between basically places that are going to get a tower later in the year and the places that for these random reasons got it just then. And so making that comparison effectively nets out all those other trends. And so like for the number of maneuver battalions present, so if we're thinking about this one, the idea here is we spent a bunch of time talking to the people who did force planning in Iraq and then for another paper later in Afghanistan, and we basically figured out like what did it take to move battalion-sized units around and how often did that happen. And that turned out, as a lot of people in this room will know, it's like a monster pain in the butt to move an organization of that size. And so it doesn't happen all the time. It's not very sensitive to like week-to-week or month-to-month variation in violence. And so then what we try to do is we figure out when you get a change in the number of forces present that is not explained by a trend in violence, we try and isolate the effect of that. And we do that through some statistical techniques. But they're driven by this understanding that you're constrained in how much you can move forces around. They're not kind of like infinitely malleable. They move in these big chunks, and they're hard to move. And so we take advantage of that to try and isolate the difference when you introduce more or less. So in each of the studies in the paper, what we try to do is some variant of those kinds of things that I just talked about, where you take very seriously the concern that you have, and you do like the best thing you can to account for it. And then you do that over many, many different studies in different countries and in different places. And if the story that emerges starts to be consistent, then you say like, yeah, I probably believe that. So that's kind of the cumulative scientific method here. The analogy that I think is worth thinking about in folks, here's future lives working with data, is if someone ever comes to you and says like, I have done the definitive study on this policy or this program, and I know this will work, you should be like, get the F out of here. Like that's just not true, right? Maybe you've contributed a piece of evidence to it, and there are a bunch of other studies that you could talk about and say like, look, we did this thing, it's consistent with all these other things that I know, therefore you should believe it. Then you should be like, yeah, cool. But if they just come to you with like that one study, you should have exactly the concern I think that you had. What makes me kind of think that all this stuff is right, that there's not one underlying cause, is when we try and address that underlying cause by like exploiting the randomness in civilian casualties, or exploiting the fact that units like can't move infinitely, that they're a pain in the butt to move, or exploiting the fact that like at the end of every fiscal year, a bunch of aid money gets pumped out because it has to be spent. And we do all these different things, and we keep finding results that are consistent with that story I told you at the start. Then we start to say, yeah, I think that story's right. I think that's kind of the right explanation. Sure, yeah. I guess the way I would think about it is like there's no free lunch. Like this stuff is hard, and it takes the accumulation to get to something you should believe. Yes, sir.
Hey, Jeff Dinsmore. Great presentation. I think a lot of guys in the building here probably are reliving 10-year-old frustrations. A lot of us saw things like this work at the local level and wondered about the disconnect between that and things like national level governance and economy and stuff like that. But could you extrapolate, or did you extrapolate any further into variances from one unit to the next? Some units did this very effectively in their local areas, and then they rip out with another unit which comes in with the hammer. And were you able to demonstrate those kinds of things as you talk through this?
So I've not personally looked closely at that. one of my students, Austin, who I mentioned before, Chris Price, who's getting his PhD at Yale, who's an Army veteran, and a colleague at University of Chicago have looked into this very carefully with data from Afghanistan and Iraq. And as far as they can tell, it is basically impossible to predict based on commanders and units' past experiences which ones were going to be more or less effective, and B, completely unrelated to future promotion patterns. So they can't find a link between like relative performance of units given like prior experiences in their area and later promotions. But you know, so I think there are two ways to take that. One is that there's some intangible thing which just is unrelated to past experiences. I think the other way to take that is there's so many things going on here that like your skill is one input, but there are many, many other inputs. So for example, we looked very carefully, Steve Biddle and I looked very carefully at what happened in 2006 to 8 with the surge in Iraq and the awakening movement and things. And there were idiosyncratic reasons for the local Sunni insurgents to change sides in different places at different points in time. And as soon as they did, almost every place that they did, there's a massive reduction in violence for lots of reasons. But you can imagine that one of the things which would predict success or failure is, did you happen to be in a place where the local leader on the other side had the foresight to think that this was a good thing to do, or was one of the last ones to move? And your performance there in those years would have depended hugely on just, did you get an early mover or a late mover as the tribal leader in your area? So I think it's just really hard to predict.